Thank you. Well, good evening. I bring you greetings from the People's Republic of Santa Monica. As I used to say on the campaign trail, whenever I was out with my wife, half of the Republican population of Santa Monica had left the city, and so I stand here as 25% of the Republicans living in the People's Republic. I know what it's like to live behind enemy lines. And like few kinds of shifts in personality is leaving where I live, my condo in Santa Monica, and driving the 15 miles north up to the School of Public Policy at Pepperdine. I leave surrounded by Leninists, I arrive surrounded by Friedmanites and those who understand the Federalist Papers. But in many ways, the School of Public Policy is unique as a graduate school in preparing leaders who understand not only the quantitative aspects of public policy, but also the importance of working in the American context. And so I've already been approached by someone with a son who's about to graduate Hillsdale, wondering if this might be a place for them to pursue graduate studies. I would heartily support that. For any of you who have kids or grandkids that are thinking about grad school, I would only encourage them not to go to law school. But other than that, I'd be happy to talk about opportunities at the School of Public Policy. So I'm here to talk tonight about viewpoint diversity. And I know when I talk to adult audiences, because I do a lot of speaking on college campuses, it's usually the adult audiences that say, well, there's nothing really new here. And of course, academia is on the left, so what are we going to do to fix it? There's not really, it's always been this way, it's always going to stay this way. Now, when I speak to college students, I hear something different. And one of the things that I've learned in speaking on college campuses for about 5 or 6 years now, encouraging them to pursue careers in academia, to think about going to our graduate school at Pepperdine, and this is something that I want to make clear just from the start, is that I went to undergraduate school at George Washington University in the mid to late 80s. When I was going to graduate school, we actually had some conservative faculty members, and those who weren't conservative were at least liberal in the sense that they were open to the free and open exchange of ideas. That day is over. And for reasons that I'm going to get into, there are some things that you need to know about how bad it is, but also about the opportunities there are, not just for students, and I can see that there are at least a few students in here, but for those of you who are older, that have kids or grandkids that are thinking about going to college or maybe in college today. Some of you are longtime and supportive alums of your undergraduate institutions. And some of you, as somebody approached me here before, just realized that after many years of supporting his undergraduate institution, his alma mater, realized that he was giving bullets to the terrorists. And for reasons that I'm going to get into, there's actually some reasons for hope, and there's some things that we can do. I am not here to tear down one of the most important civic institutions in the United States, and that is our system of higher education. That is not going away, folks. And as much as we want to say that, you know, this is the way that it's always been, or this is where things are going, we just got to, you know, grit our teeth and bear it, there are things that we can do, and I want this to be something that's actually proactive. So I'm not here tonight to throw rocks at academia. I'm here to talk about the new research that's out and some exciting things that we now know about the experiences of conservative faculty and conservative students, and things that you all can do as those who might be influencing young students or prospective students, or those that, again, might be influential from a donor or development or advancement perspective. So just so you know, I'm going to be going through a lot of data points in these slides. And I am promising to give you, sir, this slide deck that's going to be available to everybody here. So if you miss something or something's not clear on the slide deck, all these slides are going to be made available to you. I hope that you find them of use. So I want to begin with first talk about what our founder believed. The Pepperdine School of Public Policy was founded by the late, great social scientist, Dr. James Q. Wilson. It was Wilson who understood that it was a place, that academia was a place for conservative minds to participate and engage in, and somebody who helped shape our unique curriculum. But for reasons, again, that I'm going to get into, it's important that we take his identity and commendation and example seriously. Second, I want to pull apart where we are in academia to first look at faculty and then look at students. So with faculty, it's worse than you think. And I'm going to talk about some data points that prove that. And for students, it's tougher than you think, for reasons that I just mentioned. That even if you went to school at a time where most of your faculty was on the left, it's tough to describe, although I'm going to try to, how difficult it is for conservative students on college campuses today. Next, talk about what we can do, and then conclude with why I'm hopeful. Are you hopeful? I don't think you're hopeful. Now, I want to talk about why we're having this talk now. Because there are some things that we know now that really wouldn't have made a talk like this possible even 5 years ago. So a few reasons why we're having this conversation now. One, we have much more and better research about what's happening in the balance between conservative and progressive faculty, and also we're doing a much better job of understanding the views and perspectives of students. And I'm going to go through that. Second, the campus protests and conflict that we've seen, certainly here in the Bay Area and other places, I think have gotten the attention of people that never really thought about this. Maybe they don't have kids in college anymore. Maybe they're on the left and they really just don't think this is that big of a deal. But when they see people with black masks throwing bricks and garbage cans through state publicly owned property, they're beginning to realize that something is not right. And in that, there's an opportunity, I think, to engage them in a discussion around this topic of viewpoint diversity. Third, the growth of conservative student organizations, right? We all know about many of the big ones that are out there. I see that we've had some speakers from some of these organizations as well, whether it be YAF or College Republicans or ISI or other groups. Really what's happened is that as conservative students have been more and more excluded from classroom conversations, they have created their own communities. And in that, there are some really great opportunities to learn from them about their experiences. And then finally, I want to conclude with the growing bipartisan academic movement called the Heterodox Academy, which I think provides us all with some hope that we are going to begin to see a change. We're already seeing a change over the last couple years, but over the next decade, I really do believe we're going to see the largest change in the partisan makeup of faculty and students that we've ever seen. So I want to begin here. This is a quote from the obituary in the New York Times to the late, great Dr. James Q. Wilson. In his obituary, Dr. Wilson was noted in the New York Times on March 2012 by the paper's Bruce Weber, who described Wilson as, quote, an avowed conservative, arguing, for example, that strict punishment for criminals, including the death penalty, has a deterrent effect on crime. But Weber acknowledged, even his critics acknowledged, that he was less an ideologue than a scientist. And then this particular op-ed concludes with a quote from Wilson himself. And this is where I want to use as our springboard for the rest of the conversation. I know my political ideas affect how I write, but I've tried to follow the facts wherever they land. Every topic I've written about begins as a question, and I can honestly say I didn't know the answers to those questions when I began looking into them. Now, isn't this what we want our academics and scholars and researchers? Isn't this the perspective that we want, right? We want a place in academia and in social science research and in our classes that we're beginning with questions and not answers. One of the things that we talk about at Pepperdine is that we're about teaching students how to think and not what to think. And what's happened, as I see so many of the undergrads come to us from great schools all over the country, is they have been taught what to think and not how to think. These are not critical thinkers, folks. And if there's anything that I would criticize where we are in the polarized partisan climate of many undergraduate programs, is that we are not preparing citizens. What do we want of a citizen? We want somebody who can think critically and play well with others. And really what we've developed are cohorts, millions of people that have gone into positions of leadership, oftentimes public leadership, that have no clue how the other half thinks or feels. And they're not able to even criticize their own points of view. This is a problem not just for what happens in the college classroom. This is a problem for the world that we all live in. So I want to get into some data points, and I want to first let you know about a terrific book you should all buy. It's called Passing on the Right. It was co-written by two scholars, John Shields, who's at Claremont McKenna, a friend of mine, and Josh Dunn, who's at the University of Colorado. This is a book that was comprised of interviews with over 200 conservative faculty at universities and college all over the United States. It's the most comprehensive focus group study survey of American faculty, conservative faculty, done in the last 2 decades. And what came out of his research was that particularly in the social sciences, what we see, as you see here in the bullet points, is that we actually have more Marxists self-identified as social science professors than we do self-described conservatives. Now, one of the points that Shields and Dunn make in their book is, they don't, and I wouldn't care if every physics professor in the United States were an avowed Marxist. Engineering is engineering. Math, except for some parts of the Common Core, is math. But where we need to be concerned is the influence of political partisanship in the social sciences. And so this book is really looking at the lives of conservative faculty who are teaching courses like history, political science, social sciences, anthropology, and so on. As a demonstration of how difficult it is to be a conservative faculty member, and again, they were interviewing subjects from Pepperdine and the policy school, to Ivy League schools, to big state schools, and small Christian, faith-based private schools. Not a single name is used in the book. Over 200 interviews, not a single professor would put his or her name in print. Now, again, I want to be very specific about what we're criticizing here, is that when we get into these politically related subjects, like your history and political science and sociology and anthropology and so on, this is when political perspectives can have a real impact on what's studied and how it's discussed in the classroom. This is a graph from the book, and it goes to the point that I was making before, that really since, if you went to undergraduate school in the 50s, 60s, or 70s, or even the 80s, as I did, the political polarization and partisanship of academic tenure-track faculty has changed dramatically in the last 30 years. And so you see there in this chart, when we began, and the beginning part of this is around 88, 89, you see that at the top part of the graph, you see self-described. These were tenure-track faculty asked where they fit on the political spectrum. At the top there, you see progressive. On the purple line, you see moderate, and on the red line, you see self-described conservative. You see when we began, there was certainly some sort of connection between self-described moderates and progressives. Conservatives were always the bottom red line. But at least you saw back in the 80s, which was the last point where there was some sort of connection, that you saw some sort of balance. But as we get into the 90s and 2000s and to today, you see where the graph goes. And the real split happens between the self-described moderates, faculty members, and the progressives. What happened there? What happened was the faculty that had come of age during the GI Bill in the 50s and 60s, who had served out their 25, 30, 35 years of an academic career, were now being replaced by the baby boomers. And as that change began to happen, the baby boomers obviously were coming to college and going through programs in the 60s and 70s. Campuses were highly radicalized. The social sciences became highly radicalized. And as those people graduated into positions of tenure track teaching, you see the split where the moderates that usually, for the most part, came out of the GI Bill era were now being replaced by those that had come from a more partisan and progressive education. So let's look at Harvard, shall we? This was a survey done by the Harvard Crimson. It was printed in the spring of 2018. And you see there a couple different graphs. One was the election, and this was of Harvard faculty. One was the election. And you see there the significant number of people that had voted for Secretary Clinton. If you were able to dive into the little slivers, you would see a less than 3% number for President Trump. About 89% voted for President Clinton, and then less than 3% voted for President Trump. As you move into job approval rating, you see that chart on the what would be the right side of your screen. And you see the approval for President Trump is at about at 1%. Now, what this is a window into one of America's great academic institutions and the difference with which people living in Cambridge and teaching in Cambridge and working in Cambridge, Massachusetts, how different the life and perspective they have from the vast majority of everybody else. Now, what this means, as we get into some more specifics, as I said, there's been some great research done, and this was done by two economists profiled in the Washington Post in 2017, looking at 7,000 tenure-track faculty in the top 50 schools in the U.S. News and World Report, and asking them, or looking at their party registrations. Now, I understand party registration isn't a perfect signal for political perspective. I also understand that there are registered Democrats who are very good teachers and don't introduce their political perspectives into class. But I think it's interesting when you see across the board in America's top 50 schools how dramatically partisan they are. So these again are just tenure track faculty in the social sciences, and when they broke it out by specific schools, you see there at Brown, the ratio of Democrats to Republicans was 60-1. When you start looking at the UC schools, whether it's UC Davis in the 20s-1, UCSB also in that range, UCLA about 8-1, and there's little old Pepperdine at 1.2 Democrats to 1 Republican. Now, I hate to tell you this, but we're actually more conservative at the Graduate Policy School. Now, I know what you're thinking. Some of you think, Pepperdine, isn't it that right-wing Christian school? No, we're balanced. Now, we're at 1.2-1, and we're seen, I know how we're seen, towns like this and places where I live, that we're just this right-wing, faith-based bastion. But when you actually look at the party registrations, really what it is balanced. And the hallowed institutions like Brown and many of our UCs, and I would argue Stanford and others, the tilting is just so dramatic, it's hard to conceive that students are being prepared in a way that they're able to express their own opinions. Now, I'm going to get into some of those perspectives from students in a second. Now, I know you're not going to be able to see this, but again, I'm going to make all these slides available. This is a second study done by the National Association of Scholars. In 2018, it was released in April of last year, in which they looked at the top 60 U.S. News and World Report schools, looking at various subjects and their party registration, Democrat to Republican. As you can see there, about almost 40% of their sample, they could not find a single registered Republican on their faculty. And as you look down the different disciplines, starting with engineering, which is the most balanced, Democrat to Republican, that's the top. As you begin to go down the disciplines and you see those blue bars getting longer and longer, that's the number of Democrats to Republican on their tenure track faculties. And when you get down to communications, they could not find a single registered Republican teaching in any communications department in the top 60 schools in the U.S. News and World Report. Now, why is that important? It's just communications. Because this is where people go then work at networks and newspapers. These are the people that are working in communications positions on various political campaigns and think tanks and other places. They could not find a single conservative in the top 60 schools. Now, this is an issue that, again, when you get into the numbers, it bursts some of the preconceived notions. Because what you see in this chart, which was conducted by a friend of mine, Sam Abrams, who teaches at Sarah Lawrence College back east, he's done a lot of great research into the partisan balance on college faculties, is that the faith-based institutions actually do a much better job of providing ideological diversity on their faculties than private and state schools do. And even at that level, and you see it in these numbers here, even on the average, when you get into just the faith-based institutions, you're still looking at only about 20 to 30% of their faculty being self-described conservatives. But then as you move into private schools and state schools, the pendulum swings even further. So back to passing on the right. And one of the reasons why it's so important is they found over and over again, as they interviewed conservative faculty, that one of the things that conservative faculty do is they squelch their opinions. They don't talk about them in class. They don't write for the National Review. They don't write on conservative topics or topics that might be construed to be conservative. And they don't do this for fear of not getting tenure, for not being put on special committees, and for not getting journal articles approved for academic publications. Now, what this means, and this will be maybe one of the places that we disagree on, but I hope you'll at least understand from this slide why it's important. Conservatives need to support tenure in higher education. Because in interview after interview, tenure was the only thing protecting conservative academics. So what you saw, again, as these discussions happened, is conservatives would basically bite their lip for 7 years. As soon as they got tenure, they started to feel much more free to write articles in conservative publications, research issues from a conservative perspective, encourage students, participate in conservative student groups, but it took tenure to provide them that protection. Now, also why it's important, and this is proven in the book, is that there are a number of issues in the social sciences that are not being researched simply because they are construed to be something either of a conservative or religious nature. Some examples that are used in the book. we really don't know the history of the Communist Party and communist movement in the United States. We don't. And there are reasons why we don't. Because conservative professors or even liberals who are interested in the subject matter are not being supported to do that research. We don't have a good sense of how closely tied the eugenics movement was to the progressive and liberal movement in the early 1900s. Now you're starting to hear Dinesh D'Souza talk about it, but few people in academia are taking Dinesh D'Souza seriously. There are so many topics ranging from family makeup to how biases are understood that really could stand a much better academic, scholarly inspection and exploration, but they're not, simply because of what we're seeing in this partisan leaning. This was a great article, and again, I'm happy to send the link, in Bloomberg News recently, and talking about really the problems with the growing progressive presence in economics. And in the piece, what it talks about is most general economists would say that the optimal tax rate is around 30 to 33%. When they surveyed a group of scholarly academic economists, they came in between 40 and 50%. And one of the parts of the article that they said was, if you're a policymaker and you're hearing from academic economists, you almost have to discount what they say on issues like tax rates by at least a third. Now that's because we have let those kinds of disciplines be taken over by the progressives. This was a piece by the liberal Cass Sunstein, President Barack Obama's law professor at University of Chicago. He didn't teach him at the University of Chicago, but that's where they were colleagues. And even Sunstein in this recent piece talks about the damage that this partisan bias is demonstrating on college campuses for the validity of academic research and for the validity of different disciplines. So I want to talk just for a little bit about students. And I want to applaud again the Harvard Crimson. This is right from their website. And again, I'm happy to send the link. This is the annual survey of graduating seniors from Harvard. This is that image straight from the page that looks at the political leaning of graduating Harvard students. And one of the things that they look at in there are the biases on particular policy issues. I'll get into that right after I talk about the 3 questions I always ask students when I'm speaking to student groups. Number 1, have you ever been criticized by a professor in class for taking a conservative position on a political issue? 75% of the hands go up whenever I speak to conservative students and ask them that question. Second question I always ask, have you ever felt that you were given a lower grade or downgraded on a written assignment or paper for taking a conservative position on that question? About 2/3 of the hands that go up in answer in the affirmative. And then finally, I'll ask students, have you changed your major from a political science or social science major to a non-political one, say business or engineering or any of the natural sciences? Have you changed your major just because you couldn't take it anymore? And about 25% of the hands go up. Now, this is what gets me up in the morning. Folks, we cannot continue to let go a major civic institution in which our kids, especially those who are conservative, are not pursuing their own happiness, are not pursuing the majors that they want, because they are being ridiculed in class and downgraded on papers for taking a conservative position. We just cannot let this happen any longer. It is not good enough for our kid that wants to be a PhD historian to say, you know, junior year, I'm just going to get a business major. I'm just going to finish out and take business classes because I can't see myself putting up with another 7 years of this. Not good enough. So this is the Harvard class. You see a significant leftward leaning of the graduating students of 2018. America's best and brightest. Now here's another thing that we should know as conservatives. Sometimes we think that higher education is brainwashing our kids. Something we need to get a little more used to. Colleges are getting liberal and progressive kids. They're not getting brainwashed. The changes between that chart for the seniors and that chart for the incoming freshmen is not that much different. Right? But it's important at least that we respond, especially to those kids, as we would for any other minority on the right side of that chart. And this is Harvard. So there were some other questions asked by the Harvard Crimson of their graduating students. 78% of Republicans say they withheld their opinion in class. 59% of liberal students said professors should include trigger warnings about their class material. And in the 2016 election, 89% voted for Secretary Clinton and 3% voted for Trump. Now, one of the things that I think we're also going to begin to learn as I get into the last part of my presentation is that this talk about free speech on campus is real, and the belief that the progressives are on the side of open thought and free speech is being belied every single day. Now, you're not going to be able to see this. Again, so I'll send it along in the slide deck later, but this was a survey done by YouGov last year of college students looking at why students withheld their opinion in class. And what I want to point to, the red bars are the very conservatives, the gold or yellow bars there are for conservatives, moderates, progressive, very progressive there in the blue. And where you see the blue or the red and the yellow bars growing as you move to the right is where the question is asked, I didn't offer my opinion in class because I feared either professor was going to downgrade me on assignment or report me to the administration. And as you see there, if you add those two bars together, even as you move all the way up until the last question, you are dealing with over 50% of self-described conservative college students. Now, this is a quotation from a graduating Smith College student in her college newspaper as she was graduating. And I just thought it was interesting to talk about a conservative perspective and the guts it took for this one student to write. And she talks about walking on eggshells. And you see the quotation there. During my first days at Smith, I witnessed countless conversations that consisted of one person telling the other that their opinion was wrong. The word was offensive. The word offensive was almost always included in the reasoning. Within a few short weeks, members of my freshman class had quickly assimilated to this new way of non-thinking. They could soon detect a politically incorrect view and call the person out on their quote-unquote mistake. I began to voice my opinion less often to avoid being berated and judged by a community that claims to represent the free expression of ideas. I learned, along with every other student, to walk on eggshells, to fear that I may say something offensive. That is the social norm here at Smith College. Now, I want to pivot a little bit to talk about what's happening and why I'm hopeful. And I hope at some point in the next week or so, you look up the website, Heterodox Academy, Heterodox hellacademy.org. It began in 2015 by this gentleman, a terrific social psychologist and researcher, Jonathan Haidt at NYU. He's a self-described progressive that, to his great credit, was beginning to see in college classes conservatives being squelched. And he also saw friends of his who were conservative scholars not having their journal articles accepted. And so he gathered a small group of about 15 academics, some conservative, some progressive. In 2015, it's now up over 2,000 members across the country, all teaching scholars, most of them tenure track. And essentially what they've done is all sign a commitment to promoting greater viewpoint diversity on their college campuses, both inside their classrooms, in faculty hiring, and in administration. That's a little look at the website. Now, one of the things that you can do, it's really great now that they're up over 2,000 members, is they actually have a searchable database of their members. Now, these could be progressive professors, but they've at least committed to the importance of viewpoint diversity on their college campuses. And again, you're not going to be able to read these, but these are, I just did a search for area colleges, Stanford, Cal, Santa Clara, San Jose State. These are, if you looked on the website today, these are faculty members teaching in these schools. Some may be conservative, some may be progressive, but they've all committed to viewpoint diversity. One, John Etchemendy, who is former provost at Stanford, is one of the signatories. So I want to go through the 7 steps and close here with things that we can do. First is to understand the importance of research. All of the research that I've just mentioned is findable at the Heterodox Academy website. In their blog, they're always profiling new studies to show both how dramatically left-leaning the social sciences have become, but also where the opportunities are. Second, support viewpoint diversity in your college campuses. I know some people that I've given this talk to adult audiences. Some of them have gone out and bought that book, Passing on the Right, and sent it to the provost of the school that they know best, right? Some of them have looked through the Heterodox Academy database and written a note of thanks, addressed it to members of the faculty who have signed on to the principles of viewpoint diversity. As we look at some of the other points, most are beginning to understand the problems on college campuses, and that's an opportunity. The riots that we see off campus are in some ways a manifestation of the lack of viewpoint diversity that's happening inside the classroom. Now, I want to also mention here a great quote from Michael McConnell. Some of you might know him, professor at Stanford Law. I put together, moderated a panel for conservative faculty in San Francisco about 1.5 years ago. And when we were talking about the challenges to conservative faculty and conservative students, Professor McConnell had this great response. He said, the greatest victims of ideological homogeneity are not conservative students. The greatest victims are the liberal students. They are not getting a proper education. They don't learn the very important task of having to talk to others and persuade others of a different disposition. Now, here's one of the leading professors at one of America's great law schools telling any parent who would listen of their progressive kid, hey folks, your kids are not getting the same level of education as the conservative kids that are coming here, because they're being passed right through when it comes to classroom debate. They're not being questioned for their positions in classroom or what they're writing. And I think McConnell makes actually a pretty compelling point. I know when we see the conservative students that come to us at Pepperdine, they understand how the left thinks. And frankly, the majority of progressive students that come to us have no clue how a conservative thinks. Now, if we're here to prepare public leaders, I'm not saying we need to turn you into a conservative, but you better darn well at least understand how the other half thinks. And that's what McConnell's talking about. So I'm going to close with this example about another thing you can do. I mentioned in the 7 steps, encourage the school that you care about to conduct a climate survey. Now, a lot of colleges already do this. A lot of colleges conduct these climate surveys to ask their students, what does it feel like to be a person of say a minority background? Are you being treated well? Are you being mistreated? But the level of question that's not being asked is on the ideological side. If you're a conservative student, what does it feel like to be a conservative or progressive student? And because of Pomona College, another great private college, there were so many complaints by conservative students to the president. The president, who I know, took the very gutsy step to bring in the Gallup organization to do a climate survey of all the students and faculty at Pomona. All this information is available on the website, and this is what they found. So when you're looking at a series of questions here about freedom of speech, and do you feel free to express yourself, in question after question, the liberal students were the ones that said that we need more rules and regulations around what can be said and can be written. And the conservative students were all about, we need more rules and regulations to protect free speech. And this is all up on the Pomona website. Here were some other questions about, more important for colleges to accept and allow all types of free speech. You see the dramatic swings in numbers between conservatives and progressives. Again, this is probably too small to read in the back, but what you see here again are another series of questions about how conservatives are treated, again, in a terrific liberal arts college like Pomona. The conservative students are the ones that don't feel free to express themselves, and it's the progressive students who are the ones that are demanding further controls on free speech. Now, this is something, because Pomona is a respected institution, this is something and a set of questions that should be happening on every college campus in America. We all should know, and especially if you're an engaged alum at the What's the Matter You, you should be able to ask your president and say, Mr. or Miss President, I see Pomona College, a top-ranked liberal arts school, just brought in Gallup to ask this series of questions. I would like to know how conservative students are treated on this campus. We should know these things, and we should definitely know these things in the UC system. We should definitely know these things in our public institutions of higher ed. We care, and we should care, about how ethnic minorities are treated on our college campuses. We should not throw that baby out with the bathwater, but we should also know how our conservatives are treated as well and support them. Did anybody see this recent piece in The Atlantic? Anybody read The Atlantic? We read it? This was a study done earlier this year, and this is why I'm going to close in hope. This is a study on political tribes, and one of the pieces, it was essentially a set of questions for, I think it was 7,000 or 8,000 registered voters about their opinions on American political life. And essentially what they came out with was there are 5 political tribes in the United States, all the way from very liberal to very conservative to moderates in between, splits out different ways. And there were a bunch of ways in which the different tribes saw different political questions and our president in different ways. But on this one question, across the board, across the political tribes, and across these ethnic groups, one thing was consistent. Americans cannot stand political correctness. Now, this is too far away for me to read this. Maybe too far away for you to read this. But this was a breakout of all the different ethnic groups, and as you see, they're ranging from the low 70% to over 80%. different demographic groups. And again, this is liberal and conservative to people who classify themselves in the middle. Huge majorities of Americans think that this era of political correctness has gone too far. What are the two groups who were at least half or less than half thinking it was a problem? Those with a master's degree or above, and those who described themselves, the group that thought the political correctness was the lowest problem, were those on the far left. Now, this is what you can build a movement around, people. You know, as was mentioned, I ran for statewide office in 2014, and as I like to say, I ran as a Republican, which is why I'm now dean of the policy school at Pepperdine. But one of the things that experience really taught me is, and especially as a conservative and a Republican, you better be about thinking what the coalition is that you're going to build to win something. These are people that you can build a coalition around. People who think the left has gone too far in this area of political correctness. Now, I invite you to read this Atlantic article because there are some great quotations from people of different ethnic backgrounds saying, you know, just these classic quotations from the focus group saying, I don't know what you call a Native American anymore, right? Or I don't know what you call this group or that group. I always feel like I'm walking on eggshells. And so one of the fears I know many of you have, and I've had to a degree, is are the things that we've seen on college campuses, is it bleeding out into society? And to a degree it is. But this survey lets me think and lets me know that there is actually hope. That even people who will never vote for the same presidential candidate we will, they hate political correctness. And they will support free speech. And they will want to know what's happening on their colleges and campuses. And so I am hopeful that in this next decade, with groups like Heterodox Academy, surveys like this, that we can turn this tide. And with your engagement, whether it's your grandkids going to college or in your alma maters, there are things that you could do this week to let the places where you're engaged and involved in know that, that you want to see more transparency and more viewpoint diversity. And with that, thank you.
One of our guests was intrigued by your comment, maybe it was just in humor. Why not law school?
Okay. No, if you want to practice law, I would encourage anyone who wants to go to law school to go to law school. What I've seen, though, especially as the dean of a policy school that's recruiting students, is that particularly conservative undergraduates think that the way that you get to Capitol Hill or the way that you make change in politics is by going to law school. They don't really have an aspiration of practicing law. They just think that's the path. That's what you do to get elected, right? You have to be a lawyer to run for office because that's what all people that run for office do. My encouragement is that there's another path, and it runs through Malibu, and we prepare candidates like me and others in 2 years instead of 3.
This next question, it's actually is a little thought-provoking. When not enough American students are majoring in STEM, why should we regret that students are abandoning history to major in engineering?
Well, because I think that, as a conservative, I want students to pursue their happiness. And happiness to me is not about being funny happy. It's the more classical understanding of happiness is to pursue your calling. And I don't want people who don't want to be history majors or academics or PhDs in history or political science. I don't want to force a square peg into a round hole. But doggone it, if you're a kid that loves history, loves reading about it, is really turned on about, you know, studying history, I don't want you to feel excluded. And one of the things that I think the social sciences and the liberal arts do for you is they teach you humility, which is something else I think we're lacking quite a bit in this culture. And so if you're studying the great ideas and the great books like we do at Pepperdine, students come away realizing that they're not the smartest person in the room anymore. And so I don't want to force kids into the liberal arts. At the same time, when I ask that question, as I always do of college students, how many of you have changed your major because you just felt so attacked in the classroom? And when I see 25 to 30% of hands go up, that really breaks my heart. It really breaks my heart. And I think we should be about supporting kids, especially conservative kids, into academia who want to pursue that path.
Yeah, it was definitely different skill sets. So you just can't switch just because which is, I agree, very sad for those poor social scientists and liberal arts students. So we have a couple questions dealing with the Atlantic article.
Yep.
And someone wants to know specifically, do you know the month and the year? I thought it was recently because I had heard, and there's some very funny quotes about
that article, I believe, is from either March or April. But again, I'd be happy to route the link back to you. But the study was, if you just Googled political tribes and the Atlantic, you will no doubt find that. But I'm happy to send along the link when I send over the PowerPoint deck.
And then part B was, do you think the term political correctness means the same to all the groups? Or I'm sure as the survey was set up, there was some background given?
Yeah, so there was a definition given of political correctness, and it had to do with speaking about how one could speak about other demographic or minority categories. And again, that phrase about walking on eggshells was really endemic throughout the piece, because not only did they go over the data, they went over some of the focus group conversations that happened. And across ethnic groups, people were just tired of wondering what they should call people, what they couldn't say. If there were stereotypes that they had seen borne out, well, we could never say that. It just was this anxiousness that people felt in diverse environments.
Yeah, in fact, I think one of the funniest was, it's not just how do people refer to other people, but people of identified minorities themselves, they were uncomfortable, so they couldn't.
That's true. Yeah. That's true.
Do that there.
They didn't get the memo.
Yeah.
Right? That somebody who's some PhD in sociology has come up with a new label for something, and we didn't get the memo on that.
Yeah, that's right. I really know how to do that. Okay, so another question was, critical thinking is promised in grades 1 through 12, but not delivered or taught. What can we do so there's hope for the kids to stand up in college? And so that's actually a good question. There's a huge range in a child's development between grades 1 and 12. Do you think there's a point where it's too late? And when do we need to start that process?
Yeah, I think it does. In the latest, it needs to start in junior high. I think that, as I showed before, that graph of the Harvard students and how dramatically left-leaning the graduating students were, and as I said, if you were to look at their chart from the incoming class, there was some swing to the left, but it wasn't dramatic. And so these kids are coming from top high schools, and I think you would see that even more broadly. I mean, I just think this generation, I came of age in high school and college when Reagan was president, and a proud member of the Reagan Revolution, and that really changed the way I thought about politics. But these kids have had a different experience. And so again, I'm not sure that I would even change that. It's fine if 80% of high school kids going into college are progressive. I don't have a problem with that. Do you understand how a conservative thinks? If you don't get that, that is a problem. And in survey after survey, and again, just so much anecdotal evidence because of kids coming to us from great undergraduate institutions, the progressive students that come to us just cannot believe that somebody thinks about economics the way our conservative kids think. And they get over that. We don't tar and feather them. You know, we welcome the progressive kids to Malibu. But at the same time, it is about that critical thinking aspect of first criticizing yourself and your own thoughts, and then being able to understand how another thinks.
And sort of along those lines, this is a great question. Did the president of Pomona University change his opinion, assume it's a his, based on the Gallup, her
Yep.
opinion based on the Gallup results?
She has not changed her opinion, but this survey was just conducted last spring, right? So this really is very fresh data, and at least in some of the reporting that I've seen after it, there are the discussion of policies being put in place and continued surveys to see if there are ways they can make conservative students more welcome, but at the same time to teach the liberal kids who obviously have no clue what free speech means. You saw it in that Smith College example that, you know, this whole thing about language is violence is an infernal perspective. And that is really, that's the piece that has really gotten into so many of these college environments, that the words you use can somehow be understood to be violence against someone else. And that's the way the kids are responding in that survey, and that's the thing that Pomona is going to address.
Yeah, that's good news. We've got a couple questions here which have a personal nature, which is wonderful. First one is, as a college student, I encountered a lot of your truth, my truth. What's your take on moral relativism in colleges?
Well, it's a problem, right? Because as we teach at Pepperdine, there is a truth. Now, you can have your story and your experience. You can have your story and your experience. But one of the ways in which you teach critical thinking is you try to teach it through the Socratic method, that without being violent about it, you should be able to ask questions about why you think what you think. And so I think sometimes what conservatives think when they get into that moral relativism is sometimes, frankly, the progressives misunderstand what moral relativism is. Sometimes progressives think that moral relativism is what's true for me is true for me, and what's true for you is true for you. We don't ask the second question, well, why do you think the way you think? And I've found in a lot of my conversations with my neighbors in Santa Monica that actually opens up some amazing conversations when it's asked in a humble and really curious way, as opposed to even trying to persuade that other person. And if it is asked in a real, honestly curious way, okay, well, why is that your truth? Where did that come from? Because I think this way because of reasons A, B, and C. I think that can be the beginning of some amazing conversations. So I wouldn't get caught on the your truth, my truth there. I would try to press a step further and say, okay, you want to use that phrase, your truth, that's fine. Why is that? Because then you're actually getting the person to think, so maybe the way I think this way or for a certain set of reasons, and the way you think this way or for a certain set of reasons. I'll just say that Jonathan Haidt, who's the research psychiatrist who heads up the Heterodox Academy, wrote an amazing book called The Righteous Mind. Anybody read The Righteous Mind?
Yeah, it's great.
The Righteous Mind really, it looked at what he calls the 5 moral foundations of every human civilization. And when he lays the 5 moral foundations over conservatives and progressives, what he finds are different moral foundations are responded to by progressives versus conservatives. And it really helped me understand myself as a conservative much better, but it also helped me really understand how progressives think. Because one of those 5 moral foundations is what they call caring and fairness. And if you really want to get sideways with a progressive, think back as to whether you were triggering, whether they were feeling you weren't caring about them, or that you were talking about something that they perceived wasn't fair. Conservatives are actually triggered by other things. We're triggered by a respect for authority and the holding of things sacred in a society. But what's incredible about that book is that conservatives actually have some appeal to all 5 moral foundations, and what Haidt found was that progressives are only connected to 2. So you can see we're much more morally balanced as conservatives. But it is important to understand how they think, and I think that's a great book for doing that.
It's really great. Yeah, what does make either side tick? I know there's no answer that you can give for this, Pete, but it's so heartfelt. I want to share it with the group anyway. My semi-conservative daughter graduated from college and is now teaching elementary school, elementary teacher. She's now leaning left. Help, what do I do?
Well, I certainly don't know this story, but here's what I would guess is that there are political progressives and there are philosophical progressives. And I would guess that if you get, in our complex, we have a LAUSD teacher who lives in the apartment above us, and I see the LAUSD, the United Teachers of Los Angeles, every once in a while it gets put in our mailbox. I don't know how you could read that for 2 months and still stay a conservative, right? And so in that, if this person is in a teachers union or very involved in, teachers, especially public school teachers, those are very politically charged environments. And how conservatives are thought of, again, read The Righteous Mind. Especially when you're talking about kids, you are going to be looking at triggers of fairness and caring. And we know as conservatives, we don't care about kids, right? We don't care about them. And we also are very much about protecting ourselves, and we don't want to be fair to anybody else, right? Let's just admit it. But that is what the ethos is in a lot of public schools in particular. And especially when you're being paid by public tax dollars, that will change how you think about politics. And I remember during the campaign, I went to one of the big teacher union conventions in Los Angeles because there was a subgroup of conservative teachers in the teachers union. And this was the California Teachers Association annual convention. Of course, there were thousands of people at the Los Angeles Convention Center. In a room about the size of this stage was the breakout room for the conservative teachers in the California Teachers Association. And so, so it was an interesting conversation about what it was like for them. We've been talking about academics and higher education. But that environment is very politically charged in elementary schools as well, especially in public schools. And so trying to think differently about what's good for me, whether it be raising taxes to pay my salary versus what's good for the environment that I work in or the place where I live or the community where I live. Again, I would just advise that the daughter as well as the parent reads Righteous Mind.
And we'll leave it at that. That's the other. This is a great question. So this evening we spoke about the faculty, we talked about the students, and now there's one about the administrators. Oh. The commenter said there's bad or worse than the faculty, set up at orientation week and what they're calling indoctrination week. I'm sure they don't call it that, but that's what it is. And with safe places, we know the thing. Let's talk a little bit about the administrators.
This is a terrific point, and if I had more time, I would get into it. There has not been enough research. There was only one study done in the last year of administrators, but it's what I call the academic diversity complex. I think you may have seen the story about the University of Michigan and the size of their diversity department. It's something like 40 or 50 full-time staff and tens of millions of dollars. Again, this is an area that I think we need to slipstream, right? This is a very good point, that it's not just the professors, it's the administrators, especially these growing diversity departments, that there's an opportunity there. These are the ones that are conducting those climate surveys, right? So I would go to the provost or the president and say, well, you obviously care about diversity. You have a 37-person diversity department. What I'm interested in is how conservative students feel here. What are you doing about that? I know you're surveying the students about how African Americans feel and Hispanics, and that's all good. I'm glad you're doing it. But I know that from looking at other surveys like this one they just did at Pomona, that it's very possible that conservative students don't feel like they can express themselves. Will you do something about that with your diversity department, Ms. President? So I think we need to without saying that they need to tear down the diversity department, we need to take advantage of it and use that language to essentially, and especially now the growing amount of research, to make sure that if this is really about, if diversity, which diversity is, the diversity academic complex, and I've heard people at certain institutions tell me this, is we want everybody to feel as welcome as they would in any college. Now this is kind of interesting talk for reasons I'm not going to get into. But if that's the goal of your diversity department, you've probably got a couple thousand kids on your campus, depending on the size of your school, that really don't feel they can open their mouth in the classroom. It would seem to me that that would be something, if you cared about diversity, something you'd want to look into.
That's a great answer. This is interesting because I think we're kind of both baby boomers here, but so this takes me
right
back.
On the edge. I'm just on the edge of Gen X.
Gosh, okay. Do you not think that perhaps all the deferments for college during the Vietnam War packed the social science departments with progressives who became the directors and then turned the curriculums more to the left?
Absolutely right. I don't have anything to add to that.
You didn't even have to think about it. That
Nope.
was just all right, we'll make this the last one. I know I think your voice is going, so we really appreciate you hanging in there. We've been talking for a long time. How can retirees engage with future influencing of programs in schools? I mean, unless you're a huge donor and can say something, what can you do more on a grassroots level?
Well, I think that if you are an alum, even if you are not an engaged alum, that you have every right to call your alma mater at any time or send a note, or to look at the Heterodox Academy website to see what faculty are already teaching at your school that are at your alma mater that support these principles of viewpoint diversity. I think sending a copy of Passing on the Right to a provost or a president is never a bad idea. Sending them a link to the Pomona College survey, where they brought in Gallup to do a professional survey of their students, is something that is always worth asking for. But at the same time, I also understand that you have kids and grandkids that are going to school and making decisions about where to go to school. And if your kid or grandkid happens to be a conservative and they're thinking about going to Stanford, or they're thinking about going to UC Santa Cruz, there are members of that Viewpoint Diversity group that teach at UC Santa Cruz. And I just pointed out at least 15 faculty at Stanford that are members of this Viewpoint Diversity group. Send them that list and say, you ought to check out, you ought to track down these professors. And because I think those are actually beacons of light on these college campuses. And now that, 3 years ago, this group was 15 people, it's 2,000. I'm sure it's going to be double that in the next 2 years. This is a real academic movement, and it's coming from the left and right, like all good movements do. And when you're trying to affect an institution, you've got to get the majority party on board. And that is happening through that. So again, with the resources that are out there, sending them along to a president or a provost, again, when you can get into a discussion where academics are talking to academics, that's when you win. And I hope I don't rub anybody the wrong way on this, but Molly Yiannopoulos is not going to change a provost's mind or heart on this. You know? But great conservative academics are, and we've got them. We need more of them. And that's what I'm trying to encourage through this. But there are people out there that in almost every single college in America that support the principles of viewpoint diversity. And when you start to see, I know the president of Pomona. I don't know her well, but I know she's definitely a person of the left. And again, I give her great credit for conducting this survey, because really it does demonstrate that they have a problem in their campus climate when it comes to a minority, and that minority happens to be conservative. So.
Well, you did leave us on a happy note. So before we disband, I think there's some Pepperdine materials somewhere on the tables that were brought there, so if you're interested in what they're doing. And thank you so much. A nice round of applause for Pete Peterson, please.
Thank you.